The galaxy was ancient, full of countless races, mighty civilizations, and proud empires. Some had existed for millions of years, shaping the stars themselves. Others were young, still learning how to survive among the endless void. For ages, wars had come and gone, but one truth remained. No empire believed it could truly fall. Among these great races were the Vaeri. They were known as proud, noble, and strong. Their fleets of shining silver ships filled the skies, and their cities glowed like jewels across their homeworlds. They were once seen as unbreakable. The Vaeri believed nothing could shake their power. But then came the Krolax swarm. The swarm was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before. It was not an empire of people nor a kingdom of rulers. It was a tide of living nightmares spreading from one system to another. The Krolax did not conquer, they consumed. Entire planets vanished under their hunger. Fleets were shredded apart as though made of paper. Wherever the swarm went, silence followed. The Vaeri fought bravely. Their fleets clashed again and again with the swarm. Worlds turned into burning graveyards as the battles raged. Millions died and still the swarm came. For every Krolax ship destroyed, 10 more appeared. The Vaeri began to fall back. One proud world after another was abandoned. Fear spread through their people. The unbreakable race was breaking, so the Vaeri did what they had never done before. They cried out for help. Their distress calls echoed across the stars. Messages were sent to the elder races, the mighty alliances, the powerful empires that claimed to value peace. They begged the great councils for aid. They promised alliances, trade, treasures, anything, but no one answered. The elder races saw the Krolax swarm for what it was, death without end. They weighed the risk and decided the Vaeri were not worth saving. Why sacrifice their fleets for a war that could not be won? Why throw lives away for a doomed people? The silence from the galaxy was louder than the swarm's roars. Each day, more Vaeri ships were destroyed. More cities burned. Families fled into the darkness, hoping for safety, but finding only despair. The proud race began to believe they were alone, abandoned, forgotten. Hope turned into dust. Until one day an unexpected signal arrived. It was not from the elder races. It was not from the powerful empires. It came from a small young species that most of the galaxy barely noticed. Their fleets were modest. Their weapons were simple. They had no ancient legacy, no towering empire. The signal came from humans. The voice was clear, carrying both strength and warmth. "We hear you," it said. "You are not alone." At first, the Vaeri were stunned. Why would humans answer? Why would they risk everything to stand against the swarm? They had no treaty, no duty, no gain. To help the Vaeri meant facing certain death. But the humans did not hesitate. Convoys of human ships left their worlds carrying food, medicine, and supplies. Old warships, patched together with human stubbornness, set course for the Vaeri colonies. Pilots with steel in their hearts prepared for battle. They came not for profit. They came not for conquest. They came simply because someone had cried out for help. For the first time in years, the Vaeri felt something stir within their broken hearts. It was small, fragile, and yet powerful. It was hope. And as the swarm loomed ever closer, the galaxy watched in silence. They called the humans foolish, reckless, naive. But in the darkened skies of the Vaeri, the ships of Earth shone like stars, and the proud, broken Vaeri whispered the name of their unlikely saviors, humans. The Vaeri council sat in silence as the human message echoed through their chambers. For hours none spoke. They could not believe what they had heard. The elder races, those with fleets so vast they could block out suns, had turned away. The ancient empires, proud of their wisdom, had ignored their pleas. Yet these newcomers, these humans, had answered. The counselors whispered in disbelief. Humans had no reason to come. They had no trade agreements with the Vaeri, no treaties, no shared borders. Their worlds lay far away, small compared to the glittering capitals of the galaxy. Their technology was young, their fleets modest. To the Vaeri, and to most others, humanity was barely worth notice, and yet it was humans who came. The first human convoys arrived like a fragile dream. Their ships were not majestic works of art like Vaeri cruisers. They were practical, heavy, dented from years of use, but inside them were crates of food, medicine, and supplies. Human engineers brought strange tools, offering to repair broken stations. Human doctors worked day and night to heal Vaeri children poisoned by war. For the first time since the swarm began, the Vaeri saw compassion. Not calculation, not politics, just compassion. On the outer colonies, human soldiers stood guard beside Vayari defenders. Their armor was scratched, their weapons simple, but their courage burned bright. A Vayari mother, fleeing with her children, would never forget the human soldier who lifted her daughter into his arms and carried her through fire. The galaxy looked on and shook their heads. "Foolish humans," they said. "They waste their lives on a dying race. They do not understand what they face." But the Vayari began to whisper another word. Hope. The swarm did not rest. It came again, blackening the stars with its endless tide. The Vayari fleet, broken and weary, could barely stand. But now human ships flew beside them. The Vayari generals had warned the humans, "You cannot win. You will only die." The human admiral had replied calmly, "Maybe, but if we stand together, you may live." And so the humans fought. Their ships were smaller, their firepower weaker, yet they flew like wolves against a storm. They shielded damaged Vayari cruisers, diving into enemy fire. They broke blockades to deliver supplies. When swarm creatures landed on Vayari soil, human marines ran to the front lines, shouting with voices full of fire. The Vayari, who once believed themselves abandoned, now fought with new strength. They were no longer standing alone. They were no longer fighting only for themselves. They were fighting for the strange newcomers who had come so far just to stand beside them. A battle was won. Not a great victory, but a survival. For the first time in many months, the Vayari fleet did not fall. Their people did not face total destruction, and at the heart of it all were the humans. In the aftermath, the Vayari gathered around their human allies, watching them with new eyes. These were not the fragile beings the galaxy mocked. These were not fools wasting their blood. These were men and women who looked into the face of certain death and still chose to fight. A Vayari child once asked a human soldier why he had come. The soldier knelt, smiled, and answered with simple words, "Because someone had to." That answer spread through the Vayari like fire. For a people who had felt abandoned by the galaxy, it was more powerful than any fleet. The swarm still raged. More battles were to come. More worlds would burn. But the Vayari no longer looked into the future with only despair. For in the darkness of the void, alongside their own broken ships, they saw the lights of humanity, small, fragile, yet unyielding, and those lights gave them the strength to believe again. The swarm returned like a storm without end. Their ships poured into the skies of another Vayari world, black shapes spreading across the stars like a sea of shadows. The ground trembled as their monstrous creatures descended, tearing into the soil, devouring everything in their path. The Vayari defenders were already weak. Their fleets, once shining with thousands of vessels, now numbered only a few hundred scattered ships. Their generals knew the truth: they could not win, yet they stood weary and desperate, determined to die with honor. Then the humans came. Their ships broke through the blockade, small compared to the massive swarm vessels, but full of fire. They came fast, their engines burning, their weapons hot. They did not slow, they did not wait. They charged straight into the heart of the swarm. Vayari eyes widened as they watched the battle unfold. Human destroyers flew in tight formations, weaving through impossible odds. A single human frigate shielded a damaged Vayari cruiser, taking volley after volley until it finally broke apart in fire. Yet even as it died, the cruiser behind it lived. On the ground, human soldiers fought shoulder to shoulder with Vayari warriors. The swarm came like a flood, claws and teeth tearing into defenses. But humans did not retreat. They set up heavy weapons, firing until the barrels glowed red. They threw themselves into the line when the Vayari were about to fall. Their voices rose above the chaos, not of fear but of defiance. One Vayari commander could hardly believe what he saw. "They fight as if this is their own homeworld," he whispered. A soldier beside him, bloodied but standing, answered, "Perhaps to them, every world under threat becomes their home." The Vayari had seen sacrifice before, but never like this. Human pilots rammed their ships into swarm carriers, detonating their reactors to save others. Marines refused evacuation, choosing instead to hold bridges and choke points so civilians could escape. Their courage was reckless, foolish even, but it saved thousands of lives. And for the first time in years, the swarm did not win. The skies cleared, piece by piece, as human and Vayari fleets fought side by side. When the last swarm vessel exploded, a silence fell over the battlefield. Smoke rose from ruined cities. Ships burned in orbit. The losses were heavy, but the Vayari were still alive. Their world still stood. In the aftermath, survivors walked among the ruins, stunned. They expected death but found life. They expected to be abandoned but found allies. The Vayari people began to look at the humans with awe. These were not the fragile beings the galaxy mocked. These were warriors unlike any they had known. Not because of their strength, not because of their weapons, but because of their will. That night, around makeshift fires, Vayari civilians gathered with human soldiers. Food was shared, stories were exchanged, and slowly walls between the two races began to crumble. A young Vayari boy sat beside a human pilot, staring at the stars. "Why do you fight for us?" the child asked softly. The pilot looked up at the dark sky, his face weary, his eyes full of quiet fire. "Because we know what it feels like to be small," he said. "We know what it means to be ignored, and no one deserves to face this darkness alone." The child did not fully understand the words, but he remembered the warmth in the human's voice. For him, and for many others, the humans became more than allies. They became a symbol of something the swarm could never destroy. Hope. The Vayari fleet had survived another battle. Their cities still stood, and though they knew the swarm would come again, the Vayari no longer faced it with only despair. They faced it with a new fire burning in their hearts, a fire given to them by the most unexpected of saviors, humanity. The victory over the swarm gave the Vayari a breath of hope, but hope came with a heavy cost. For every city saved, countless human lives were lost. For every fleet that returned, many ships never came home. The humans fought with all their strength, but their numbers were not endless. On one Vayari world, the people lined the streets to welcome back the survivors. But as the ships landed, the truth became clear. Too many had not returned. Whole squads were gone, their names now spoken only in whispers. A Vayari mother wept as she realized the human soldier who had carried her daughter to safety was not among the living. The humans did not hide their pain. They mourned openly, holding ceremonies for their fallen. Pictures of sons and daughters were placed on walls, candles lit in the silence of night. The Vayari, who once believed themselves proud and unyielding, watched in awe. Even in grief, the humans stood together. One Vayari elder asked a human commander why they continued to fight, even as their losses grew heavier. The commander, his face lined with exhaustion, gave a simple answer: "Because no one else would." Those words struck deep. The Vayari had begged the galaxy for aid and received only silence. Yet these humans, small in number and young among the stars, gave everything they had, not for profit, not for power, but because they refused to let another race die alone. As the swarm returned again and again, the humans kept coming. Their fleets grew smaller, their ships older, but their will remained unbroken. Human engineers worked through sleepless nights to repair Vayari defenses. Human doctors fought to save every life even when supplies ran low. Human soldiers stood on the front lines with no thought of retreat. The Vayari began to see humanity in a new way. They were not the fragile newcomers the galaxy mocked. They were something else entirely, something stronger than technology or numbers. They were stubborn. They were relentless. They were willing to sacrifice everything for what they believed was right, but sacrifice left scars. In the quiet hours after battles, Vayari families invited humans into their homes. Meals were shared, laughter forced through tears. The two peoples grew closer, bound not by treaties but by blood spilled together. A bond stronger than politics was being forged, a bond of trust and gratitude. Yet the shadow of the swarm still loomed. Each victory was costly. Each day brought new attacks, and whispers began to spread. How long could the humans continue? How many more could they lose before their will broke? A young Vayari officer once asked a human pilot that question. "How do you keep fighting when you lose so much?" The pilot looked at him, eyes tired but steady. "Because if we stop, then every life already lost means nothing. We fight so their sacrifice has meaning." The Vayari officer carried those words into battle. They burned inside him like fire. Slowly, something began to change within the Vayari themselves. Inspired by human courage, they started to fight not only for survival but for each other. They began to believe again in unity and sacrifice, in hope. For the first time since the swarm began, the Vayari felt like more than victims. They felt like warriors again. The swarm had taken much, but it had not broken them. And it was the humans, the unexpected, reckless humans who had reminded them of who they once were. The galaxy still watched in silence, expecting both races to fall. But the Vayari knew a truth the galaxy did not. They were not fighting alone anymore. And with humanity beside them, they believed survival was possible. The swarm was not finished. It gathered its strength, pulling fleets from every corner of its dark empire. Soon the stars themselves seemed to dim under the shadow of the endless horde. The Vayari knew what was coming. It would not be another raid, another attack. It would be the final blow, a storm so great that no fleet could withstand it. Fear swept through the Vayari worlds. Families fled deeper into space. Generals whispered that the end was near. Even with human help, the numbers were too great. The swarm had decided to crush them once and for all, but the humans did not run. Instead, Earth sent its call across the void. Every ship, every soldier, every resource was gathered. Civilian freighters were turned into troop carriers. Old warships, pulled from museums and scrapyards, were reforged into weapons of war. Humanity had no illusions. They knew many would not return, and yet they came. The Vayari were astonished. They had expected their human allies to retreat, to save their own worlds, but humanity was different. When the storm grew darker, their fire only burned brighter. Admiral Jonathan Hale, the leader of the human fleet, stood before both his own people and the Vayari commanders. His voice carried across the command halls, steady and strong. The swarm wants to end us. Alone we fall. Together we rise. This is not just the Vayari's fight. This is our fight, and we will not stand aside. The Vayari listened in silence. Many wept openly. They had once been proud and unyielding, but despair had broken them. Now, hearing the words of a human, they felt something stir again, a fire that had almost been lost. The humans had a plan. It was reckless. It was dangerous. It was human. Instead of meeting the swarm in open battle, they would strike at its heart. Deep within the endless fleets was the hive mind ship, the central core that linked the swarm together. If it could be destroyed, the swarm would lose its unity. The tide might finally be broken, but to reach it meant flying into the center of the storm, where no one was expected to survive. The Vayari generals argued. They called it madness, but the humans only smiled grimly. Madness, perhaps, but it was their only chance. Slowly, the Vayari leaders agreed. They would not let humanity fight alone. For the first time since their fall began, the Vayari prepared not just to defend, but to strike back. Their fleets, battered and bloodied, gathered alongside the humans. When the swarm came, the sky burned. Billions of black ships descended upon the allied fleets. The battle was chaos from the first moment. Human frigates and Vayari cruisers fought side by side, weaving through the darkness. Explosions lit the void as thousands of ships on both sides were torn apart. The swarm screamed, endless and merciless, and yet through it all the humans pushed forward. Their ships formed a spearhead, carving a path toward the hive mind ship. Every kilometer was bought with blood. Every advance cost lives, but they did not stop. The Vayari followed. For years they had only known retreat. Now, inspired by human courage, they surged forward with fury. Their cannons tore holes in the swarm lines. Their warriors shouted with rage and pride, no longer victims but fighters once more. Together, human and Vayari fleets forced their way deeper, closer to the heart of the enemy. The losses were unbearable. Ships vanished in fire, soldiers fell by the thousands. Yet still they pressed on. And then, at last, the hive mind ship came into view, an enormous, grotesque shape pulsing with dark energy, surrounded by swarms like a fortress of nightmares. The humans sent out their final message. We will break the heart of the swarm. Stand with us, and together we will end this. The Vayari responded with one voice. We stand. For the first time in history, the two races were not savior and saved, not protector and protected. They were brothers in arms, united in fire. And as the swarm closed in, the galaxy held its breath. The allied fleet surged forward, human and Vayari ships locked together in one desperate charge. Around them, the swarm filled the stars like an endless sea of teeth and claws. Every direction held death. But still, the humans pushed onward, dragging the Vayari with them toward the hive mind ship. Explosions painted the void in fire. Human destroyers dove straight into enemy lines, clearing paths for the heavier Vayari cruisers. Vayari warships returned the favor, unleashing heavy barrages to shield the smaller, fragile human vessels. Every maneuver, every sacrifice pulled them closer to their target. On the bridge of his flagship, Admiral Jonathan Hale stood tall. His eyes were steady, though the deck shook with impacts. "Keep pressing forward," he ordered. "If we fall here, we fall together. But if we reach that monster, we end this." The hive mind ship loomed ahead, a grotesque mass of living metal and pulsing flesh. It radiated a sickly light, its tentacle-like towers sending signals that controlled the swarm. Destroying it meant cutting the head from the beast. But to reach it, they had to survive waves of defenders that fought like demons. Human pilots pushed their fighters to the limit, engines screaming as they darted between enemy swarms. Many never made it back. Some, realizing they could not return, turned their final moments into weapons, slamming their burning fighters into swarm carriers to open a path. On the ground below, where swarm creatures landed to overwhelm cities, human marines and Vayari warriors fought back to back. Blades and claws clashed in the streets while explosions rattled the skies above. Every soldier knew the truth. The battle above would decide everything. If the hive mind fell, the swarm would break. If it survived, all hope would die. The Vayari fought with a rage they had not felt in centuries. They remembered their fallen worlds, their lost families, and they poured all of it into their weapons. They had once thought themselves doomed, but now standing beside humans, they burned with new strength. Forward. A Vayari captain roared as his ship blasted through a swarm cruiser. "For every world they took from us, we take this fight to their heart." The humans heard the cry and they answered with their own. "For Earth! For the Vayari! For everyone who fell!" Together, the two races became something neither could have been alone. Finally, the Allied fleet broke through. The hive mind ship was before them, enormous and vile, pulsing with dark energy. Swarm defenders swirled around it like a living shield. But the humans and Vayari no longer cared about survival. This was the moment. Admiral Hale gave the order. "Strike teams, go." Small human and Vayari ships launched toward the hive mind, diving through enemy fire. Many were destroyed before they even reached it, but a few made it through, weaving through impossible odds. They carried the most dangerous mission of all, to pierce the hive mind's core and detonate their payloads inside. The pilots knew they would not return. They went anyway. One human pilot, her ship burning, sent a final message. "Tell my family we stood our ground. Tell them we fought to the end." Then her ship slammed into the hive mind's outer hull, exploding in brilliant fire. More followed. Human and Vayari alike hurled themselves into the monster, sacrificing everything. Piece by piece, the hive mind's defenses cracked. And then, with one final blast, a human bomber broke through, plunging deep into the hive's core. Its reactor overloaded, exploding with the force of a small sun. The hive mind screamed. The sound echoed across every channel, across every battlefield. The swarm faltered, ships losing coordination, creatures on the ground thrashing blindly. The tide that had once seemed unstoppable finally broke. For the first time, the swarm retreated. The Allied fleets, though broken and bleeding, watched as the endless horde dissolved into chaos. The nightmare was ending. In the silence that followed, the humans and Vayari knew the truth. They had struck a blow that would change the galaxy forever. But they also knew the price. So many names would never be spoken again. So many lights had gone out. The battle was not just victory. It was sacrifice carved into the stars. The battlefield was quiet now. Where once the sky had burned with endless fire, there was only drifting wreckage. Shattered swarm vessels floated like broken bones in the void. Human and Vayari ships, many crippled and scarred, moved slowly among the remains. They had survived. Barely. Admiral Jonathan Hale stood on the bridge of his flagship, his uniform torn and bloodied. He looked at the report scrolling across the screen. The price of victory was written in names. So many ships gone, so many crews lost. He closed his eyes for a moment, then whispered, "We will remember them." Across the galaxy, the news spread like a storm. Worlds that had once watched the swarm consume everything now learned of the impossible. The hive mind was dead. The endless hunger had been broken. Billions lifted their eyes to the stars with hope they thought they would never feel again. The Vayari homeworld, still scarred from swarm attacks, held ceremonies in every city. For the first time in generations, their people walked the streets not in silence or fear, but in pride. They carried banners not only of their own race but also of humanity. Songs were sung of warriors who had come from a distant blue planet to stand with them when no one else had answered. One elder spoke to a gathering of young Vayari. "We believed we were doomed. We cried for help and no one came except humans. Remember this, children. Remember that when our sky was falling, it was their voices that said, "You are not alone." On Earth, the cost was felt deeply. Families wept for fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters who would never return. Yet grief was mixed with pride. Humanity had proven itself on the grandest stage of all. They had faced the nightmare and refused to turn away. They had stood not only for themselves, but for another people too. In schools and halls, children listened to stories of the battle. They learned the names of ships that had sacrificed themselves: the Valor's Edge, the Starlight Dawn, the Iron Spear. Each name became a symbol of courage. For the Vayari, the war became more than survival. It became rebirth. They rebuilt their worlds, but this time they did not rebuild alone. Human engineers walked beside them. Human doctors tended their wounded, and human soldiers stood guard until the skies were safe again. What began as an alliance of desperation grew into something deeper: brotherhood. Admiral Hale visited the Vayari capital months after the victory. He stood before a vast monument being built in the center of the city. It was shaped like two hands, one human, one Vayari, clasped together, rising toward the stars. Beneath it, the names of the fallen, both human and Vayari, were carved into stone. A Vayari leader turned to him and said softly, "Your people gave us more than survival. You gave us hope. From this day we will never walk apart." Hale only nodded. His voice caught in his throat as he replied, "We didn't come to be heroes. We came because it was right, because no one deserves to face the darkness alone." And so across the galaxy the story spread. A doomed fleet had cried for help and only humans had answered. That truth became legend. Other races began to see humanity not as fragile newcomers, but as something far greater. A people who carried fire in their hearts, who would rush into the storm for the sake of others. Generations later, when children of both species asked about the day the swarm fell, the elders would say, "It was the day the galaxy learned what it meant to be human." The stars were no longer cold and silent. They carried the memory of sacrifice, the bond of two peoples, and the promise that even in the darkest times, there would always be someone willing to stand and fight. Humanity had written its name in fire across the heavens, and that fire would never be forgotten.